American whiskey is whiskey, a distilled beverage produced from a fermented mash of cereal grain, produced in the United States. The primary types of American whiskey are bourbon whiskey, rye malt whiskey, wheat whiskey, Tennessee whiskey, and corn whiskey. All of these are made from mashes with at least 51% of their named grains. Also included are blended whiskies, blends of straight whiskies, grain whiskies, and spirit whiskies, which do not specify a dominant grain. In the case of blends, American whiskies may include artificial colors and flavorings. Laws regulating the above products vary between those produced for consumption within the United States and those exported abroad. Regulations. The production and labeling of American whiskey is governed by Title 27 of the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations. Outside of the United States, various other countries recognize certain types of American whiskey, such as bourbon and Tennessee whiskey, as indigenous products of the United States that must be produced, although not necessarily bottled, in the United States. When sold in another country, American whiskey may also be required to conform to local product requirements that apply to whiskey in general when sold in that country. In some cases, this may involve stricter standards than U.S. law. Canadian law requires that products labeled as bourbon or Tennessee whiskey must satisfy the laws of the United States that regulate its manufacture for consumption in the United States. Some other countries do not specify this requirement. This distinction can be important, as U.S. regulations include substantial exemptions for products that are made for export rather than for consumption within the United States. Some key types of American whiskey listed in the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations include rye whiskey, made from mash that consists of at least 51% rye malt whiskey, made from mash that consists of at least 51% malted rye malt whiskey, made from mash that consists of at least 51% malted barley wheat whiskey, made from mash that consists of at least 51% wheat bourbon whiskey, made from mash that consists of at least 51% corn maize corn whiskey, made from mash that consists of at least 80% corn. To be labeled as one of these types, the whiskey must be distilled to no more than 80% alcohol by volume, 160 U.S. proof, to ensure the flavor of the original mash is adequately retained, and the addition of coloring, caramel, or other flavoring additives is prohibited. All of these, except corn whiskey, must be aged at least briefly, although no minimum aging period is specified, in charred new oak containers. These restrictions do not exist for some similarly named products in some other countries, such as Canada. American corn whiskey does not have to be aged at all, but, if it is aged, it must be aged in used or uncharred oak barrels, at not more than 62.5% alcohol by volume, 125 proof. In practice, if corn whiskey is aged, it is usually aged in used bourbon barrels. Tennessee whiskey aging in charred new oak barrels at the Jack Daniel's Distillery. Straight whiskey is whiskey that was distilled to not more than 80% alcohol by volume, 160 proof, that has been aged for at least 2 years at a starting alcohol concentration of not more than 62.5%. It has not been blended with any other spirits, colorings, or additives. A straight whiskey that also meets one of the other above definitions is referred to by combining the term straight with the term for the type of whiskey. For example, a rye whiskey that meets this definition is called a straight rye whiskey. Unqualified whiskey without a grain type identification such as bourbon, rye, or corn must be distilled at less than 95% alcohol by volume, 190 proof, from a fermented mash of grain in such a manner that the distillate possesses the taste, aroma, and characteristics generally attributed to whiskey. It must be stored in oak containers, charred new oak is not required, and bottled at no less than 40% alcohol by volume, 80 proof. To carry the designation, straight whiskey, without a grain type identification, the fermented mash must be less than 51% of any one type of grain and must be stored for a period of at least 2 years in charred new oak containers. A straight whiskey that has been aged less than 4 years must be labeled with an age statement describing the actual minimum age of the product, whereas, if straight whiskey is stored as prescribed for 4 years or more, a statement of age is optional. Furthermore, a straight whiskey or other spirit produced from a single class of materials may be labeled as bottled in bond if it has been aged for at least 4 years in a federally bonded warehouse, is bottled at 50% alcohol by volume, 100 proof, and is the product of one distilling season. Other types of American whiskey defined by federal regulations include the following. Blended whiskey is a mixture that contains straight whiskey or a blend of straight whiskies containing not less than 20% straight whiskey on a proof gallon basis, and, separately or in combination, other whiskey or neutral spirits. For the blended whiskey to be labeled with a particular grain type, i.e., blended rye, malt, wheat, or bourbon whiskey, at least 51% of the blend must be straight whiskey of that grain type. The part of the content that is not straight whiskey may include unaged grain distillates, grain-neutral spirits, flavorings, and colorings. Blend of straight whiskies is a mixture of one or more straight whiskies that either includes straight whiskies produced in different U.S. states or coloring and flavoring additives, and possibly other approved blending materials, or both, but does not contain grain-neutral spirits. Light whiskey is produced in the United States at more than 80% alcohol by volume and stored in used or uncharred new oak containers. Spirit whiskey is a mixture of neutral spirits and at least 5% of certain stricter categories of whiskey. However, it is important to note that these various labeling requirements and standards of identity do not apply to products for export from the U.S. under CFR Title 27, Section 5.1. Thus, exported American whiskey may not meet the same labeling standards when sold in some markets. Another important American whiskey labeling is Tennessee whiskey. This is a recognized name defined under the North American Free Trade Agreement (NAFTA), at least one other international trade agreement, and the law of Canada as a straight bourbon whiskey lawfully produced in the state of Tennessee. Tennessee whiskey production is also governed by Tennessee law. Tennessee House Bill 1084 was passed in 2013 for products produced in the state labeled as Tennessee whiskey. It included the existing requirements for bourbon and further required use of the Lincoln County process for filtering the whiskey through a thick layer of maple charcoal before placing it in barrels for aging, with an exception grandfathered in for Benjamin Pritchard's distillery in Kelso, Tennessee, which does not use it. The two major brands of Tennessee whiskey, Jack Daniel's and George Dickel, are both produced using the Lincoln County process.